Okay. Hello. The topic for today is a little bit talking about technologies, how to use figures more extensively than you might have thought about in the past. I simply want to show you some ideas how to design your database a little bit differently in several aspects. I know, for example, from customers that we often have sometimes information inside the database which are not completely reproduced. For example, like when I go open this database and when I go to the database statistics, for example, simply start the database statistics, I often have the following problem, that when I see the result of the database statistics, I see a lot of different versions here, but this is not the case with what I wanted to show. But I see, for example, here a statistic value. Who's aware of what the statistic value does? In general, a few people definitely already know what the statistic value is for. And what do you think what a statistic value of zero means? Unused or useless? Depends on whatever you think. The Firebird server itself uses the statistic value for optimizing. For example, if you have an index which has a larger selectivity, a better selectivity, it is much better to start with this index compared to another index. So it's a really easy example how you can imagine how this works. For example, if you think about how many people live in Bremen and how many of them are male, for example. And you have to think about the database server with the database of Germany, and you would think about how many people in Germany are male. It seems to be that almost 41 million of 82 million might be male, except perhaps some people in Cologne where you do not know what they are, but this is a different problem. But the first step of the result is from 82 million, I have a sub-select of 41 million. So it is not a good job to check out all the 41 million records for having a specific value. For example, do I live in Bremen? In Bremen live about, I think, 500,000 people. So if we would start with taking the people from Bremen and the result set would be the first result set, we only have 500,000 records in the result set. And from this number of records, you can take the next step. And this is exactly the same the Firebird server does. It needs information about what the quality of your index shows. This is one of the advantages of Firebird, that it does use a code-based optimizer. But when the code-based optimizer is looking for the index statistic value and it finds everywhere the zero number, you will get some wrong results. But you can also get wrong results in a different area. When you have, for example, the job to be done as the optimizer does, and you think about the Bremen males example, you will start with the people from Bremen, and from them you will divide them into two groups where half of them will be males. This is your plan to get the data as fast as possible. The Firebird server itself does the same thing. But he does not know how many people live in Germany, how many are male, and how many live in Bremen, because the Firebird server has no access to the data itself, like being from school or having a look at Wikipedia or so. It has to create internal values that help the optimizer to to create a query plan as fast as possible. But this results in the next problem. The statistic value is always created, definitely actualized, when the object is created. And since this database I showed already yesterday was created with an empty customer table, with an empty inventory and product table, the indices based on this table are remarked with a statistic value of 0. So this is not a good idea to have this statistic value of 0 on a working database. It's easy to recalculate them. There are different ways to do so. In IBX, it's extremely easy. We compute the selectivity of all indices. And when you do this, it does a statement which is called set statistics index, and all the index names are recalculated automatically. And when you go back here, for example, to this statistics, and recreate the statistics, we see now that we have a different value here. But there are still some values, for example, in the customer table, that show that the statistics are not so extremely helpful. It's not in the customer, it's in the product table. For example, we see here a value referencing the category ID, and it has a value of 0.0625. This value means from a specific amount of data, when I'm using a specific value of this index, I will get a typical result of 6.35% of all the records. When I get, for example, an operation based on this column, when I do a where clause based on this column, I will have the chance that 50% of all the records come back. But when you have a look at the data, select star from product, you will see that this result of the special column, in most times you have a 0. Only a few have a 1. So the statistics value is calculated for you internally how many values, how many unique values you have in the records where you have created the statistics for. But they are not, what was the name? They are not distributed among all the values in identical areas. When I have, for example, a select statement, when I simply say special count star group by 1, we will see that the value 0 is taken here internally 9,783 times, and the value 1 is only taken here 271 times. So what does this mean? If you have an index based on the first value, or the 0 value, and the optimizer will use this index, it will still almost have all records inside this index. So it's sometimes not a good idea to have so many indices with this kind of information inside. It's sometimes better, it sounds strange, but it's sometimes better to not have such an index on a column. But the main problem is, for example, when I have a look at the category ID, for example, the category ID has a much better distribution of all the values. The category ID here internally is defined as a foreign key from the product table to the category table. Here you see it directly. Due to this definition, you cannot delete the index. You cannot use a foreign key definition without an index. So sometimes if you have, for example, a table which means which has the functionality to show you if a record is deleted or not. And 99.9% of all your records are not deleted. And you have a foreign key table where it shows this one means deleted, this one means not deleted. You will sometimes see results that are really bad on this index because almost all values have the same record value, and this means in the result that I have a look at the recording session. It seems to still work. So it's not so easy possible to avoid having this index here. And for example, if we would have a new table inside this database, for example, I create a new table, create table special, ID, big and not null primary key, and text varchar 80, for example. And I simply want to add some manual data inside. For example, the 0 means the following. 0 means, for example, regular, and this one means special offer, for example. If I would now create a foreign key based on the product table, connecting the product table to this table, I will create an index which takes a lot of space inside the database, but it will be almost useless. Because if you have a result set of an index which lists almost every record, you will not have any advantage of this index. So I simply decide to not have an index on this, to not have a foreign key on this table. I simply replace the foreign key on this table by some triggers. So what does the foreign key definition itself do? It does not allow you to create a record with a value outside the specific range of values in this foreign key table. Example, create table. No, I will not write it everything here. I will create a new trigger. First step, I can insert a new record. When I insert a new record, it must have a value from this table. If I update the record, it also must have a value of this table. If I delete it, who cares? So I create a new trigger, which is simply an insert or update trigger, and it simply does the following. Select special ID from special, where count star I wanted to have, where special ID equals new dot special. Into a variable, I deactivate the so-called lazy make. I declare my variable here, for example, CNT, which is an integer value, and I simply say into CNT. It can be done with a subselect or in whatever way you want. This should only be done, for example, depending on the definition of the index. So you can have, for example, a more flexible way. When you declare a foreign key based on a not null column, it might be a way that you define data that might have the value null, that it might be allowed, but if there's a value other than null, it must be somewhere in the table. You can define any rule that you want to have in the data here. I simply use this way to have here a functionality if P and T equals 0, then exception. And I simply want to add a new exception here. I make it a little bit easier, since I do not want to have an exception for any operation defined individually. Way to create such a trigger, and you can define a user-defined exception with a user-defined text, and you can simply write a text that is not saying you, okay, I have now a foreign key violation, and your end user says, what for a foreign key violation? I do not know that, especially when you do not write your application in English language. Yeah. Sure. You can also use several ways how to get the data. For example, there are some SQL commands like you go into the axis, select whatever, then, or it's not axis, so you can do it, you can implement it in the way whatever you want. But since the select will be doing a select on the primary key of the table with 2 records, it will not be such a big problem for the database server. But it depends on how many operations you will do. Usually, insert or update trigger. So when I test this, I have to test this on my product table. And I set a value here of perhaps 2. I get my error message. Lovely. And I'm not able to commit any data that I do not have required an index based on this column. But what happens the other way around? Now I delete, for example, the number 1. When you think about what a foreign key does for yourself, it is not only the thing that the foreign key has a connection to the detail table, but your detail table has also a connection to your foreign key, to your master table. So in this case, there will be sometimes some more or less bad ideas. So, for example, if I say before update or delete, in that case, the index is not critical for me, because when I insert a new record, I do not have to check all the existing records. But an insert or delete, an update or delete, should be done in a different way. And now, when I have an index based on the table, so for example, now I can use if not exists, or if exists, I have to think about the syntax. I make it if exists, set select ID from product, not, yeah, just one, special from product, where product special equals old.id, then error, you cannot delete this value before, because at least one record exists. In product. Whatever you tell on that moment might be okay. But yes. Yeah. one. Yeah. No. I look for the value in the special path. Yes. Exception would be a nice word in this case to make the database server understand what I want. Okay. To test this functionality, I go to the special table. I try to delete the special offer. I does not allow to. The main advantage of using this app in a way as a combination of different combinations between the database tables itself and the foreign keys to replace foreign key, for example. You still have the possibility to add a constraint with the foreign key, and this foreign key, for example, can be taken from the table special on the column ID. And here you have the possibility, what is an update rule? So for example, if I update a foreign key value from my table to this table, it should be also updated. I do not want this in this way. In the loop rule, what happens when my detail table is deleted? I can cascade operation, or set the value to null or whatever. Object product in use. Data type does not fit. I think I have the special defined as an integer and the special table is defined as a big int. So you have, for key definition, the data type is not fit for a trigger definition that you create on yourself who cares about the data type. So defining a foreign key is still possible. It should be no problem, but you are not as flexible as you can do it without foreign key. Yeah. For example, if you insert a new special number, for example the number 2, you insert new data already. Yeah. In that moment, the trigger fires, the trigger itself looks for a value inside this table, which will receive only value. You will see this table entry, and this might be a problem in that moment, definitely, because in that moment, it was still in the area where, for example, we said, I found this value in my reading transaction, in my reading operation based on this table, and in that moment, it was still valid for me. But it can be the case, I think, almost similar to the foreign key definition. I do not know exactly, it depends on what you use, for example, for transaction control. If you use read committed, for example, and the first one is already committed, you will see all the context that the data is already there. So the access, right after it was added with the number 2, the access that was here in the second trigger made will in that moment see already the committed record when you're working with a recommitted. And this depends also on personal flexibility. Sometimes it's also a big problem to have a deletion on such a table without any preparations, for example. This might be, for example, an idea to have your own process created. How do you want to react if you really want to delete this value? So it might be also the case that you simply say, we add some more triggers that avoid that you can do this in that moment. But this depends on different ways. I want to simply show some additional things, a little bit of misuse of generators. I create a generator. I simply call it FA, like here. And I use here, for example, a simple operation. FK, FX. And I simply say FX equals gen ID FK, comma, 0. I can also do it without a variable, it's no problem, but I do it now with a variable. If fk equals 0, then begin. Yes, not fk, it's fx. So I'm here I have the possibility to reactivate my foreign key without deactivating any BDL object. I simply have to set a generator to a specific value, and this trigger already evolves in that case by own units. This might be, for example, the case when you have to import a lot of data. And in general, your tables are filled with a lot of triggers based on this operation. And when you have already an import program, that your data must not be improved if all the foreign keys exist and so on. There is much less operation needed when the triggers simply have a look at the generator, and the generator, when the generator is set, they ignore everything. This might be one case. I do not recommend this for everything. Yeah. This is exactly the thing that I want to show next. Typically, I use a specific user. If you have, for example, ever used the ABAP database, you can, for example, have a look at triggers there, and they always have the construction if current user equals, and in ABAP database it's named worst case. The username, there's a special user that can be used to ignore almost all internal operations. And as the word definitely knows, it should not be used by regular users. So do not call yourself worst case. If is your last name, you might have a problem with this database. You can also do the following thing. I do a select star from non-dollar attachments, and in non-dollar attachments you find all the attachments that are currently attached to the database, and to see more than one I do a simple ISQL localhost /135 db1 underscore 25.fdb. Okay. db program file Firebird. Set ISC user 58. Set IC password master key. Oh, password with me would be much better. ISQL. Password with a nice letter, you can write whatever you want. So it takes some work from your Y find on your keyboard. Okay, select count star from customer, for example, 10,000 customers, and when I have a look here at this monitor table, I have both connections inside. What I want to have here now is, for example, the possibility that I decide, am I using, for example, ISQL, or am I using, for example, IBExpert? And I can simply do a query here, where I simply go to the $1 remote process, select $1 remote underscore process, I think, and where $1 attachment dot, and I activate to see the system tables, because in that case I can also use them with the so-called code completion. Where $1 attachment ID equals current connection. So who am I? And if, for example, I use this SQL statement inside my trigger, I can do, for example, the following query. If $1 loop, I need to try it first, but containing IBExpert, then I should write it then. It's simple implementation. If select one remote process containing IBExpert, when I use this software or this software, I can activate a trigger based on the program I run from the database. So this is also one of the parts that you can do inside your base operations. You will simply have some ideas to use or to create individual triggers for individual pieces of software. If you have a big importing tool or something like that, in most cases you have the data inequality already before you import the data that will not result into the same testing operations of data that are perhaps required for entering data from a end user. So this might be also a way how to test all this. The $1 attachment and $1 whatever tables are really interesting for such operations. So you can not only see, for example, the current user or the current software that is used inside. You can also have a look at the IP address. For example, you can simply create a trigger and simply do based on the IP address will allow a specific operation or not. This is also possible. You can also monitor the name of the remote process ID. The remote process ID can be always found in the task manager. And when we have a look at the process ID here, we find a number as a remote process ID 4864. 4864. It's IBExpert. So it's sometimes also possible, we have created such an application for a customer who wanted to have the processes on a remote machine deleted or killed automatically, because some of the people were not able to open the software, and it was a software which was not created by this company itself, and the software manufacturer was no longer alive, so they were not able to change the piece of software. They did not have the source code, and it has a terrible transaction handling. Every time you start the software, it starts the transaction, it never stops, it never finishes the transaction until the software is ending. And this was really a bad behavior in this area, and we were not able to change the software itself, so we decided to simply have a batch job running where we have a IP address, where we have the process ID, and when we call a command line tool that is able to kill a whole process of this machine. And it might be a little bit dangerous if you do not know what you do. So it might be, if you have the wrong number here, that you kill a much more important process, and it might not be a good idea. But especially, for example, for the classic server, you can, for example, here see the monitor server process ID. And especially for the classic server, for each connection you find a zip table, which is the FBINet server process on my server, which is responsible for my own connection. And if you want, for example, to have this data stored, for example, automatically, I go to database monitoring, and I go, for example, to the statement. Here I see, for example, some statements, and I simply want to do just select statement. I simply want to copy it, and I want to create a table based on this. And as I already demonstrated yesterday, you can, for example, create a table simply in IBExpert, insert into IBE. I call it simply IBE $1 log. I started, table doesn't exist, IBExpert will create it automatically. And for example, if I want to have all the statements that can be found here in this table, the protocols inside my database. We have here, for example, the information that we have non-indexed reads, for example. We can, for example, say, I create a new trigger in this database with a specific way, not a table trigger. You can switch it to a database trigger. And this database trigger, for example, will be a trigger, I name it, for example, PRG OC on transaction commit, on commit, on OTC, I call it on transaction commit. And I simply say insert into IDE on log. I simply copy this data from this monitor table with the records around into this one-log table, because the monitor tables are non-static. You will not find the records inside the memory, for example. But if you're doing this with a database trigger, and you copy on commit the data to the table, for example, customer, commit, and I have a look here at the table. With every operation, all the data from this monitor table now is imported into this table. We definitely need some more work to be done on this. For example, I only want to have here the non-index reads where I can read some of the statement text, and where I can read, for example, that non-index reads are higher, for example, than 1,000 or so. You can monitor your database online from inside your database. Such a database trigger is a really nice implementation. You have a lot of possibilities with the so-called database triggers. And you can do a lot of really interesting things based on this technology. And the definition without IBExpert is also really simple. Create or alter trigger, active on, transaction commit position, whatever, and so on. So we can use the database trigger also for a second operation. I had done this did I have my here? I go to the recent list, and now I find what trigger I used here. Not this one was used, but this one after insert or update. I simply want to install this one here, and I want to add this in my database trigger. But this will not work if the one who is responsible for the project is, then it gets an error, yes. I'm a little bit tired, but this is always the case on the last day of the Firebird conference. So what happens now is really simple. When I do a commit here and a quit, and I restart ISQL, containing bad position to implement this there, because the on commit requires that I really commit. It will not be the best area to create such a trigger. I want to have the trigger as a database trigger, but it should be an on connect trigger. So I simply want to have this combination, and now it should see I still not allowed. So I can put out specific applications, but it is not a 100% solution, because ISQL has some parameters, and one of the parameters is, for example, no DB triggers. But you need to be the owner of the database for so if you are using ISQL, you can go into your database if you have perhaps added some rules to the database trigger. Perhaps you remember what I was talking about, I think 2 days ago, on the first day, where, for example, one of the databases that we use for the IDX download center. This database is created also with IDX web, it runs on Firebird 2.5, and it has also a lot of functionality. I will talk about this database a little bit in the other session where I talk about PHP programming and so on. And we have here, for example, a database trigger, which was an on-commit trigger. And I wanted to have the results that I get from the database, from the PHP environment, in the host table. I added this functionality a few weeks ago, and I simply here store the data that we found for the specific IP address that was used to access our database system, our download center. For example, this IP address was used from this DNS entry. And I have also a different table where I get from IP addresses with countries behind that. It's sometimes really reliable, sometimes it's a little bit strange, sometimes there are countries inside that definitely do not belong to this IP address. But it's a public available list of information. I have, for example, here a table, a geo table, where I have the information, the IP address from, they are assigned to a specific country, and who is responsible for that. And what I have made in my programming was really easy. I use a on-commit trigger to have a select on this table, and the select on this table with 100,000 records inside are from the index. I never tested it severely and based on performance reasons. So every time I made a commit, there was a full table stand on this table. And this table was combined together with the table in the host table. And when I started the programming based on these two tables, I had only 10 or 20 records inside my host table. And now, as you saw, we have already 90,000 different hosts where custom connections came from. And it was really simple. It was a question between these two tables. And every time a commit came up within the last week or so, we had a select statement based on this table with a question on the host table. And I tested this last week and I found out that the on-commit trigger did a operation with 20 million operations on these two tables. And due to the fact that the database itself had no real problem, but the use of this database was almost impossible, I decided to have a look at all the modules that I have inside. And I found this database trigger, and it's sometimes like to say in Germany, the root of the use maker. So I get paid for optimizing performance for customer databases, but on my own databases I sometimes be a little bit less careful, and it's a thing you should always remember when you're working on database trigger, especially with the on-commit trigger or so. It is really fired really extremely often. So sometimes if you have a thing that should be done every 10 seconds or as fast as possible, it sometimes matters that you have running a script based on the time that you want to have on the server automatically, and not to be done within a database trigger. So be careful with database triggers. They are really good inventions, started with Firebird 2.1, but be also really careful with getting results of secret token statements inside really often fire triggers. The expert does not support this because I think I do not know exactly what API they use internally, but until now we have not tried to do so because we find on every platform an API like that. We think that if you have created the database triggers that does not allow yourself to come back into the database, you might try to start with Firebird, so the ISVL version of Firebird. After that, you might already deactivate the trigger simply by dropping the trigger or whatever, and you can go back to the database with any program. More questions? Okay. From my side, I'm finished with this presentation. I think I give you some ideas about what you can do with triggers, and I think a lot of people have now some impression that a trigger is a replacement of a lot of things for existing things inside the database. Sometimes it's really a good thing to write your own trigger. You can write your own trigger, you can create your own error messages, you can create your own exception type. You can do your own exception handle. For example, if after such a trigger fires, after index trigger or before index trigger, if it fires and it just sees that a value in a specific detail table is not entered already, you can directly enter it automatically. You cannot define this as a foreign key. For example, if you set a new record inside your master table and you have a detail table like the special table here, and you have a new entry for this column specials, in your trigger construction you can directly add a new value to the detail table. The foreign key definition is not available for the same operation. So you are much more flexible. But on the other hand, trigger also has the possibility that sometimes you add some secret statements with a lot of work for the database server. So always have in mind that when you're doing such a trigger, try to have a performance analysis on it, and to find out that this operation might be not a good idea, or you have to optimize the secret statements that are used in You can also use context variables from my point of view. The visibility sometimes is a little bit different, but the context variable seems to me also a good idea regarding this. I use it already since Firebird 1. So at that time I was not able to use context variables. So, and we also, for example, Paul is responsible for the ABAP project for the ERP system. I think you also, since almost 8 years or so, you have the same implementation inside almost all the triggers and almost all the functionalities. Since you simply want to have a different way, it does not allow work or not work inside I'm on the wrong database. In the ABAP database, you see a little bit different implementations inside the trigger and inside the stored procedure. Here, for example, there is a generator used that adds additional information inside a protocol table. So, for example, if we have a look here at one of the procedures, whatever we take here, all the procedures always start with this construction. If gen ID, and begin, which means development, 0 equals 0, then insert into what does interbase from old times. The project started with interbase, open source in that time, program path, values, and whatever. So we simply want to have a protocol in which sequence all the objects were firing, or all the objects were executed. And it's sometimes really helpful when you are in the development process. And you simply forgot that there's a trigger based on a table where you do an operation, and you do not remember that this trigger might do some other operation somewhere else. And you can see in this table a lot of entries when you have activated the generator, and you have the possibility to activate this generator on the fly. So you can, for example, say, now I start my procedure X, whatever, and with the 20th line or so, now I change the value from 0 to 1, and now this part I want to have some protocol. And after this is over, I change it back from 1 to 0. This can be done easily inside virtual construction. And this can be done, for example, in the universal base. But it has, for example, we also had in the past not only the functionality that we have created the generator from 0 to 1. We have also used it for a specific connection. For example, I see in the generator my connection ID, and if I do not see my connection ID inside this generator, I will not make it work anything. So you can use the generator for a lot of strange things where they are not created for, but they are really useful for such operations. Okay, as I showed you already, it makes always sense. For example, if you do a procedure or whatever, always have a look at this column, and when you see anything here in red, you will see that the table might have some things that you should think about. It doesn't use an index or whatever. So that's a good thing to start with when you have all the operations modules tested. And sometimes there are secret statements that can have a red line here. But there are some customers who say, I do not want to have any red line inside this view of my whole database. It's a kind of a quality control. depends on what you do with this inside. Okay, I think it's a good time for lunch. Okay, thank you.